The infamous Revolutionary War was the beginning of the United States of America. Many are familiar with the United States' decision to separate from Great Britain. But it is important to understand what led the colonists to make this hefty decision. In this video, we will consider 6 major events that led to the separation and the creation of a new nation. The Stamp Act of 1765. After the French and Indian War had ended, King George thought it fair to have the colonists help pay for the war. Wars are expensive, and it was fought to help the Americans gain more land. He figured it was the obvious answer that the New England colonists should pay for their share of the war through taxes, just as the British citizens were doing in England. To raise the necessary funds, King George imposed the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act would place taxes on goods that the colonists were importing from Great Britain. These taxes would be applied to nearly all paper products and would increase the cost for colonists. When the colonists heard about the new tax, they were not happy. They felt as though they had already paid for the war. It was fought on their land, with their men, and they had used much of their own supplies. Yes, they did need help from Great Britain, but that didn't mean they didn't contribute to the war. Many colonists decided they would not be paying for these taxes. Riots were held to demonstrate their outrage for the new tax, and collectors' homes and businesses were vandalized. The Townshend Act of 1767. The king was surprised to hear about the colonist riots and rebellion. He had helped them greatly with the war. He sent money, men, and even supplies. Feeling that it would be unfair to have his citizens be the only ones who paid for the war, he tried to impose another set of taxes. King George III made a second attempt to tax imported goods. This time, the tax was on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. The king was determined to recuperate his money. He chose to tax these goods because he didn't think the colonists would be able to boycott them or produce them on their own. To make matters even more fair, King George was going to put some of the tax money towards the salaries for the colonial governors and judges. This would help the colonists pay them and also help ensure their loyalty to the crown. Feeling confident he had outsmarted them, the king thought this would be the end of dealing with the New England colonists. When the colonists heard of the news, they were even more upset than the first time. How could the king expect this from us? They decided there was no way they were paying these ridiculous taxes. They would simply learn to make their own products. Frustrated with the Townshend Acts, the colonists decided to boycott British goods. This meant that they would stop purchasing any goods that came from Great Britain. Of course, there were a few essential items they still needed to buy, but they wouldn't purchase any that they didn't absolutely need. They planned to practice the boycott for 1 full year. During this time, they continued to show their unhappiness with the king by arguing with shop owners who still sold British goods. Some even vandalized these shops to show just how upset they were. The Boston Massacre, 1770. Riots continued to ensue in New England to demonstrate their anger with the British ruler. The king was tired of the colonists thinking they could do whatever they wanted. To control the riots, 2,000 British soldiers were sent to Boston to force them to follow the tax laws. Holding their ground, the New Englanders continued to resist the taxes and occasionally fought with the British soldiers, who they often referred to as redcoats due to the fancy red coats they walked around in. On February 22nd, an angry mob of colonists attacked a shop owner who was known to maintain his loyalty to the king. It is important to know that although many colonists were unhappy with the rules and laws being enforced by Great Britain, there were still many colonists who supported the king. A group of loyalists stepped in to break up the fight. One tried to end the chaos by shooting a gun into the crowd, but accidentally hit an 11-year-old instead. A huge fight ensued. Tensions were high in North America. Both parties were angrier than ever. On March 5th, a British soldier was doing his job, guarding the king's money, when a group of colonists came looking for trouble. They began to threaten him. Feeling unsafe, the guard fought back and even hit one of the instigators. This enraged the colonists, so they began to throw ice and stones at the soldier. Bells began to ring, warning the townspeople of gunshots, even though none had been fired. This brought a wave of angry colonists to the streets to defend their brothers. The guard, terrified, called for reinforcements. After rounds of fighting, a gun was fired by a British soldier. To this day, we are not certain if it was done on purpose. After this shot, the redcoats began firing, resulting in the deaths of 5 colonists. When the story of this day was later told by colonists, it was often told in a way that made it seem as though the Americans were calm and the British were out of control with violence. However, this is not an accurate description of what really happened. The Boston Tea Party, 1773. Due to the continued attempts to get the colonists to pay the tea tax, the Sons of Liberty planned a rebellion. The Sons of Liberty were a group of colonists who strongly believed the king was out of line. Sam Adams and John Hancock were instrumental in the planning of the Boston Tea Party. The Sons of Liberty dressed in disguise as Native Americans. They boarded one of the ships in the Boston harbor that held the tea that had been imported from England. The men were careful to not cause damage to any other goods or areas of the ship. They broke into the containers containing tea and dumped 342 chests into the water. Many patriots were proud of these acts, but others were embarrassed by the choices of the Sons of Liberty. The Coercive Acts of 1774. When King George III got wind of the acts the patriots had committed, he was enraged. He couldn't believe they were acting like children. He decided he had had enough and passed the Coercive Acts. He created these acts to put the colonists in their place and put an end to the silly games. It was time for them to follow his rules. According to the Coercive Acts, the king was closing the Boston harbor until all of the tea they destroyed was paid for. He got rid of the Massachusetts Constitution and no longer allowed them to have free elections. All judicial authority was moved to British officials and judges. Colonists were required to welcome British troops into their homes on demand, and the freedom to worship was extended to French Canadian Catholics. The king hoped these acts would put a stop to the rebellions in New England, but it had the opposite effect. These acts pushed the colonists to rally against British rule by working together to create the First Continental Congress. This committee was composed of representation from each colony, except for Georgia. They met in Philadelphia and began discussing how they would move forward against the king. The Battles of Lexington and Concord, 1775. King George was fed up with the colonists' continued rebellions. British War General Thomas Gage led a troop of British soldiers to Lexington, where they planned to capture the leaders of the Boston Tea Party, Sam Adams and John Hancock. American spies learned of the plan and rushed around to rally militiamen to prepare to meet the redcoats. The British thought they would sneak up on these men, swiftly take them away, and move on to Concord. However, the American troops had heard of their plan and waited for them. Before they reached Lexington, the rebel army was able to intercept the mission and attack the British soldiers. The start of the battle is famously known as the shot heard around the world. The battle ended with the redcoats retreating to Boston. The American militiamen were successful in stopping the British. King George finally understood the extent to which the Americans were willing to go. He knew that enforcing more acts would not work on the colonists. Both sides were ready for war. And this war would be the American Revolution.